Ethiopia's got an image problem. For years, this gigantic country, the second most populated in all of Africa with almost 100 million inhabitants, was a synonym for extreme poverty, hunger, disease, war. In short, true misery. However, in the new century, everything began to change. Even though Ethiopia is still a very poor country, in the last decade it has become one of the fastest growing economies not only in Africa, but in the world. At the same time, it has grown very close to Beijing and has also become a close ally of the United States in the fight against terrorism. Why have a single friendship if you can have both? The fact is that we're probably witnessing nothing more or less than the birth of a future African power. And that's more than enough reason to ensure that we, here on VisualPolitik, don't want to miss what's happening in a country that many are already calling the new African China. So listen up. After decades of tension, hostility, and confrontation, before and after Eritrea gained independence from Ethiopia in 1993, on July 9, 2018, both countries signed a declaration for peace. And we should remember that during this long confrontation, there were tragic moments. Indeed, the military conflict between 98 and 2000 killed nearly 100,000 people. Now, the leaders of both countries, they've agreed to sign for complete peace.
We had agreed to resume the services of our airlines, to get our ports working, to get our people to trade, and to open our embassies again. There is no longer a border between Eritrea and Ethiopia because a bridge of love has destroyed it. Abiy Ahmed, Ethiopia's prime minister.
But of course, the question remains, what has led these two countries to suddenly like each other so much? Well, my friends, even though it may seem incredible, one of the problems that prevented reconciliation was this village that you see on the screen now. It's Badme, and it's a place where there's practically nothing at all. And you see, based on the peace agreements that were negotiated in Algiers in the year 2000 to end the last war, this territory belongs to Eritrea. But in the end, the Ethiopian government realized that this didn't work for them, so those peace agreements didn't really go anywhere until now. Now Ethiopia, the stronger country between the two, after all we're talking about 100 million people against just over 5 million, they've decided to give up. Because, dear viewer, on many occasions, persisting just to look stronger is a mistake that's bad for everyone. There's nothing to gain, and there's a great deal to lose. In any case, this piece is a good reflection of the changes that are taking place. And listen up, because this might surprise you.
A Chinese model?
In recent years, Ethiopia has become one of the fastest growing economies on the planet. During the last decade, Ethiopia has averaged a growth rate of around 10% per year. For example, check out the following graphic. Here we can compare Ethiopia's GDP growth per capita with that of another rapidly growing country, Vietnam. And watch out, because Ethiopia's population is huge, and we're talking here about GDP per capita. But hold on a moment, we're not just talking about the economy. As you can imagine, all of this growth has led to some important social consequences, which is something that sooner or later always happens when a country grows, opens up to the world, and does things right. Since the year 2000, the average life expectancy has increased by 13 years. The number of workers with at least a completed secondary education has grown by almost 50%. And poverty, well, look at what's happening with poverty. Yep, I know, even today there is a lot of poverty in Ethiopia. With a simple Google search, we can find terrible situations in this country, but folks, let's be clear. Overcoming poverty isn't something that happens overnight. I mean, I wish it was that easy, but it's not. In any case, Addis Ababa, the country's capital, is a good reflection of the process Ethiopia is experiencing. Cranes, works, and projects of all kinds are absolutely flooding the city. In fact, it was here, in this city, that the first light subway in sub-Saharan Africa was inaugurated in 2015. But of course, having reached this point, the question that we must ask is, well, how on earth has Ethiopia achieved such an economic leap? Well, we could say that this country's become something like Beijing's outstanding pupil. Their growth has largely been led by essentially copying the Asian giant. See, on the one hand, the Ethiopian government has promoted the construction of enormous infrastructure projects that are essential for the country's development. We're speaking, for example, of a railway line that cost more than $4 billion and connects Addis Ababa with the Djibouti port to facilitate merchandise exports, or the greatest project in all of Africa, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. This is a giant dam on the Nile River that required an investment of around $6 billion and whose mission was to revolutionize the country's energy system with abundant and cheap electricity. And by the way, do you know who gave the investment and the knowledge for these projects? Well, surely those of you who follow this channel regularly won't be surprised. To a large extent, it was China and Chinese companies. In fact, China has become Ethiopia's biggest investor and trading partner. In other words, a large part of the country's growth has been due to its ties with China. The second pillar of Ethiopia's growth is that little by little, large state-owned companies began to operate with more autonomy and manage themselves almost as if they were private companies. This is the case, for example, of Ethiopian Airlines, the country's flagship carrier, which has become the largest African airline and now intends to compete internationally with the biggest airlines in the industry.
Even though Ethiopian Airlines is 100% state-owned, it's run like a business. The board runs it as if it's British Airways or United Airlines. Zimedine Nagatu, chairman of Fairfax Africa Fund LLC.
And finally, the third pillar, the attraction of foreign direct investment through the development of economic zones, fiscal incentives, participative financing, etc. Take a look at how foreign investments have evolved. This is how Ethiopia has begun to industrialize. Largely because of these policies and also thanks to the cost of labor, an industry that has grown a lot in recent years has been textiles. In fact, brands such as H&M, Guess, Tommy Hilfiger, and Calvin Klein already produce some of their garments in this country. But unfortunately, that's not all. Their similarities with China aren't limited to the economic part. At the same time that the country was experiencing an economic takeoff, the repression of civil liberties became stronger and stronger. The media, it was broadly restricted, political opposition was persecuted, websites were blocked, etc. In recent years, this country became one of the 10 biggest journalist jailers in the entire world. The Ethiopian government virtually locked up, forced into exile, or intimidated almost every independent journalist. In other words, Ethiopia practically reached a situation in which there were no journalists, only government spokesmen. But folks, hold on a moment, because now suddenly it looks like everything has begun to change. Listen up.
A new generation.
At the beginning of 2018, Ethiopia was mired in a wave of violence, racial clashes, and political repression that was threatening the country's stability with absolute collapse. And although economically things have worked out quite well in recent years, there have been some imbalances. A rather large foreign debt, a great shortage of foreign currency as a result of large investments and population growth, a very high youth unemployment rate. Indeed, many were wondering if what Ethiopia had gone through in recent years had been nothing but a mirage. However, against all odds, after a hard power struggle, the ruling party, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, in practice the only party, elected Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, a 42-year-old former army officer. Not much was expected, but within just a few months, boom, things have changed. You see, since he came to power, Ahmed has released many political prisoners. He has apologized for the government's abuses. He's denounced senior officials of the intelligence services and the security forces for having committed state terrorism. He's promoted the peace agreement with Eritrea. He's announced a modification to the constitution to establish the limitation of mandate. And he's begun to dismantle the political censorship and asked exiled journalists to return to the country.
Ethiopia unblocks 264 websites and TV channels.
And not only that, he has also announced that the government will deepen the liberalization of the economy to attract more investment to the country.
Ethiopia opens door to the world with unprecedented privatization plan.
Of course, as you can imagine, all of these things haven't been great for the country's elite, and their answer, it didn't take long to come.
Ethiopian PM escapes grenade attack. 1 dead, scores hurt.
On June the 23rd, 2018, during a political event in the heart of Addis Ababa in which the president wore a Nelson Mandela t-shirt, some tried to put an end to his political transition. However, they failed, and now the Prime Minister knows that he has to step on the accelerator. Ethiopia, dear viewers, it's still a very poor country that has many problems, political, social, and economic. However, the country that not long ago was considered the most miserable country on earth now seems to have an opportunity to take off. So, will it do so? Well, only time can answer this question, and of course, here at VisualPolitik, we'll be following the events very closely. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel, it's made possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please do consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, thank you for watching.